Greetings from the Hayden Clark Alumni Center here on the Hilltop. We're coming to you today from the Peploe Pavilion. I'm Tori McCord-Janetton, Executive Director of Alumni Relations. On behalf of the Bradley University Alumni Association, I'm proud to present today's webinar, Helpful Tips for Choosing Candidates in 2016. I'm pleased to welcome Brad McMillan, Executive Director of the Institute for Principled Leadership in Public Service, who will moderate our session today. Thank you also to Frank Mackaman of the Dirksen Center and Dan Pelfrey for joining us as well. Before I begin the program, I would like to encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation via the social media and online chat box. We will then answer as many questions as possible during the final portion of the session. Brad, please tell us more about yourself and a little bit more about Dan and Frank.
Thanks, Tori. As Tori said, I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Institute for Principled Leadership in Public Service here at Bradley University. And prior to coming to Bradley 9 years ago, I served as District Chief of Staff to Congressman Ray LaHood for 9 years. And I'm really excited that you have chosen to participate in today's webinar. And I'd like to give a further introduction to my two colleagues that have joined us today. To my far left is Frank Mackaman, who directs the work of the Dirksen Congressional Center. The Dirksen Center informs Americans about the work of Congress. And last year, their website received over 200 million hits. So over 200 million Americans were checking out their website last year. Frank is also an author. His most recent book that he co-authored is Seeking Bipartisanship, My Life in Politics, which he wrote with Congressman Ray LaHood. And of course, Ray LaHood is a former Bradley alumni, so that's great. And also joining me today is Dan Pelfrey, who is a proud Bradley alumni. He graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Political Science. Dan is a real expert when it comes to political communications, running campaigns, being a legislative assistant for state legislators here in Illinois. So we're real lucky that we have our two distinguished guests with me today to hopefully give you some helpful hints. Obviously, we're in a busy election season and trying to figure out what to do at the ballot box. And so the first area that I thought we would start off with is obviously the presidential election is at the forefront of everybody's minds. And I think all of us, regardless of our political persuasion, want our new president, whoever he or she is, to be able to effectively govern. And so Frank has done some research on looking at some of our most effective past presidents on what characteristics to look for an effective president of the United States. So Frank, if you want to start us off talking about those characteristics.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Tori. It's a pleasure to participate in the webinar. As Brad suggested, my interest lies not in answering the most popular question I get, which is, who is going to win? I think the more appropriate question is, who will govern us well? And I have identified some research conducted primarily by Fred Greenstein, who's a political scientist at Princeton University. And he looked at the post-World War II American presidencies and identified 6 sets of factors that account for success. And it's on the basis of those 6 factors that I've tweaked his model a little bit. And to begin our conversation, I'll just give you an overview of these 6 factors. And the first one won't surprise anyone. It's vision. So political scientists and historians have identified vision as a key to presidential success. Vision meaning the capacity to inspire. Second set of factors critical to successful presidency is political skill. Now, political scientists define political skill as the ability to create workable unity. And so I have for each of these sets of factors questions that you might ask yourself to determine whether or not a candidate or a president has political skill. But the third factor is public communication. Public communication, the purpose of it is to explain and persuade. So people want to know why they're being asked to do something, and a successful president must possess the ability to explain and persuade. A fourth set of factors, which is probably the most interesting to me, and you will never see this on any list of success factors, it's called organizational effectiveness. And a successful president has to have the ability to rally his staff and structure their activities effectively. That's organizational effectiveness. The fourth factor, cognitive style. That's the way a president or a candidate sees the world and tries to make sense of it. How the world works and why it does so is the essence of cognitive style. And then the final factor, which is probably the most important, is emotional intelligence. And that's a person's ability to control their emotions and turn them to constructive purposes. So if you take the post-World War II American presidents and rate them against these 6 sets of factors, you get closer to what made a Ronald Reagan successful, a Gerald Ford unsuccessful, a Bill Clinton successful, a Jimmy Carter unsuccessful. And it is the interplay of these factors.
So hopefully for our viewers of today's webinar, you can kind of look at the current presidential candidates and kind of assess them based on those 6 areas that Frank talked about, and kind of in your own way evaluate the candidates that we have to choose from. You know, one of the other areas that you hear a lot of the political pundits talk about is the fact that there might be a contested convention on the Republican side. And so I would like Dan to explore that area for our listeners today. What does a contested convention mean? How does it work? When was the last time we went through a contested convention? And then finally, what's the likelihood of it in this election?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to hear this described 2 ways in the media. You're going to hear it either described as a contested convention or a brokered convention. Up until this point in history, I think the terminology would be brokered convention, but with where we're at right now, the power brokers that used to broker these things are far less effective. And so we've kind of shifted to contested convention. For those who don't know, a contested convention occurs when any given candidate does not have enough delegates going into the nominating convention to receive the nomination of their party on the first ballot. For Republicans, that number, the magic number that we're all looking for, is 1,237. That is a simple majority of the 2,472 delegates that will be voting at the convention. This week, Donald Trump won the winner-take-all state of Arizona. We still have several more winner-take-all contests coming up, especially with some of the bigger states. We still have New York remaining, California remaining. And so those are going to be critical cues to whether he can secure the nomination before the convention in July in Cleveland. It's the 18th through the 21st. Where he stands currently is 739. Kasich is at 140, Cruz is at 465, and Kasich at 143 going in. So what happens if we have a contested convention? If any nominee does not have the delegates to get through? Basically, they'll just vote over and over and over again until a nominee has those. And so that's where the brokered used to come in. Each day of the nominating convention, all the delegates get together and they hear inspiring speakers, the power brokers of the party. You'd see figures like Colin Powell or Condi Rice or some of the leaders of the party from the past and the present discussing major issues. So if that magic number is not reached on the first ballot, they just keep voting. When did this last occur? Well, the last time we had a contested convention technically was 1976. That was the convention between Ford and Reagan. However, it's important to note that that was still decided on the first ballot.
Right, yeah.
So why is it a contested convention? There's what's called unbound delegates going in. Each state has a different process for how their delegates vote. Some of them are unbound. They have to support the popular vote in that state, while others, some of them are bound and have to support the popular delegate. Others are unbound and can vote however they choose at the convention. And so the last time we had it was 76 for a contested. The last one to move past the first ballot for the Republicans, you go all the way back to 1948, the nomination of Thomas Dewey. For the Democrats, it goes back to 1952 with the nomination of Illinois' own Adlai Stevenson. The longest contested convention that's ever occurred was in 1924, where they won 102 ballots at the Democratic Convention to nominate John W. Davis.
102 ballots.
102 ballots.
Amazing.
There was a lot of brokering, a lot of horse trading going on to get there.
I bet.
You may ask, why don't we see contested conventions as often anymore, which is a great question. And the answer is simply broadcast television. The 1952 convention was the first one broadcast on television. And Eisenhower and Robert Taft, it was such a nasty convention, so much animosity between them, that it looked bad on TV. And so now, we haven't really seen many contested conventions since then. Now, perhaps in this day and age with reality television, we may see them come up more, because that kind of animosity and high drama we may see actually far more appealing to the modern electorate.
So what do you think is the likelihood? I mean, you hear, like I said, all the political pundits talk about a contested convention this time around. What's the likelihood of that happening in July? Is it July 18th, 19th in Cleveland is when the Republican convention is?
Correct. Yeah, I think it's very possible that we go in at a contested convention. Do I think it's possible that we move past the first ballot? You see a lot of different predictions. My personal prediction is no. I think we're going to see a decision on the first ballot. I just don't see it going past that. I think certainly political pundits and political scientists would love it too. It's kind of their fantasy, a real life House of Cards in July in Cleveland, Ohio, but I don't think that's very likely. And one of the things that happened in the 76 convention that's interesting is we had the same discussion. Will the party come together and support Ford? And the assumption was they wouldn't, because Reagan had truly won the heart of the party at the convention, even though he did not get the nomination. But it's interesting to note, a CBS News exit poll in 1976 found 20% of Democrats crossed over to vote for Ford, while only 10% of Republicans ended up voting for Carter. So even though there was just as much animosity, just as much high drama as we see now, they still came together to support the nominee in the end.
On the Democratic side, there's also some confusion, because on the Democrat side, they have what they call super delegates. And for the Democrats, 1/5 of all of the delegates that will vote at the Democratic National Convention are these so-called superdelegates. And so who are these superdelegates? Well, they're members of Congress, they're governors, they're top party officials within the Democratic Party, and they're not bound by voters, they get to choose who they think would be the best Democratic nominee for president. And so if you look at it right now, as of today's date, when you look at the actual delegates won on the Democratic side by the voters, Hillary Clinton is up 1,186 delegates to Bernie Sanders' 899, which is relatively close. But when you factor in the superdelegates that have already made a verbal commitment, most of them have made a verbal commitment to Hillary Clinton. And so if you factor those in, right now Hillary Clinton has 1,690 delegates to Sanders' 946, and you only need 2,382 delegates on the Democratic side to win the nomination. So both parties handled their nominating process a little bit differently, and I think there's some confusion with the voters sometimes when it comes to that. Now, once we finally get through the primary season, we're going to end up obviously going towards the general election. And then we also have the phenomenon of the Electoral College in our presidential race. And of course, there was the famous election between George W. Bush and Gore, where Gore won the popular vote, but when Florida finally was decided, Bush had the electoral win. So Frank, if you can talk a little bit about that so that you can remind our listeners, give them a little history lesson on the Electoral College.
Well, I had to remind myself, and I'm sure it hasn't escaped the audience notice that we're still stuck on the question of who will win rather than who will govern us well. But it's true that when an individual voter casts his or her vote at the November election, they're not electing the president. They are electing a slate of electors pledged to a presidential candidate. And so it takes a while for the president to actually be selected, and it's a 2 or 3 step process. In the end, there are 538 electors. Each state gets the number of electors that is equal to the number of members of the House of Representatives and their 2 senators. And in all but 2 cases, it's winner take all. In Maine and Nebraska, there's some version of proportion allocation. So if you vote for a Republican, you're voting for a Republican slate of electors. They meet in mid-December in each state. Their electors meet in usually the state capital. They cast their vote for the presidential candidate. The votes are certified, sent to the Congress and to the National Archives, where they're made part of the official records, the certificates of election. And then the House of Representatives actually counts the votes the first week in January in a session presided over by the Vice President. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind about the Electoral College. First of all, although we voters elect slates pledged to a candidate, they are not bound by law or the Constitution to vote for that candidate. And so you have what's called a faithless delegate. The delegate may choose to vote for whomever she or he wants to vote for. This has happened. It has happened rarely, and it has not affected the outcome of an election yet. The second thing, which I found pretty interesting in doing this research, is that there is a combination of 12 states, and any group of 11 within the state can elect the president in the Electoral College. What that means is that a candidate could fail to win a single vote in 39 states and still end up being elected president of the United States if they win the right states. What that says about representative democracy, I'll leave to your viewers.
Yeah, it is rather peculiar. You know, and one of the other new trends that you see in our politics are the so-called super PACs. And they have the ability, especially because of the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, to raise unlimited amounts of money and undisclosed donors, and they run political advertisements, especially in the presidential race. And so Can you tell us, Dan, a little bit about how much money has been spent by these so-called super PACs in the presidential election so far, and what kind of effect they're having on our presidential race this time?
Sure. And as Brad mentioned, super PACs came about largely as a result of court decisions. The first one, of course, being Citizens United that everyone knows about, and then also a subsequent DC Circuit decision called SpeechNow.org versus the FEC. The combination of these two decisions allowed for the creation of super PACs. Well, what does that mean? Well, candidate committees have contribution limits. You're limited by the amount of money you can take from any given donor. Corporations may not donate directly to candidate committees at the federal level, unions may not, and the banking industry may not. So there was long an argument that you had speech out there that should have been occurring that was not allowed to, and that resulted in these court decisions. And so what is a super PAC? As Brad mentioned, they can raise unlimited amounts of money from individual donors. Unlike candidate committees, they don't have to disclose how their money is spent, where their money comes from, and they can support candidates that they choose to support. The only thing they cannot do is coordinate their message with any other political committee, be it a candidate committee or another party committee or any other super PAC, actually. As of this week, there are now over 2,200 federal super PACs in existence.
Wow.
Yeah. They've raised over $600 million so far and spent over $260 million, leaving still about $340 million on the table. So where have they spent their money? Well, we don't know fully, but we do know that largest amounts of it have been spent on candidates that are no longer in the race, actually. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, and Chris Christie have been the largest recipients of super PAC dollars. And obviously, they're no longer in the race, so you can somewhat judge their effectiveness so far based on that alone. Are they effective? That's largely to be determined. David Frum, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, recently had a great piece on this in The Atlantic. It's called The Twilight of the Super PACs, and it asked that very question. Is this a flash in the pan phenomenon? That is to be determined. The largest recipients or the largest ideology that has attracted super PAC dollars have been conservative-leaning super PACs. But I think the point that's been missed in much of this is now unions may make direct contributions to super PACs where they couldn't to candidate committees. So we could very well see a phenomenon as we move on where there's more liberal donation into super PACs and that they have a different effect. The interesting thing about it with super PACs is it's no longer candidates controlling their messaging. Theoretically, they're autonomous messaging machines controlled by consultants like me that no one knows about. And so you have to ask yourself, is it going to be effective, and are they the best ones to be communicating that message? I personally think that, candidates should be in control of their message, and I think that our system benefits far more when there's accountability for that messaging that's put out there.
And that gets me to an area that I really want to stress as a part of today's webinar, and that is how as voters can you find out the best information about where candidates stand on issues and positions that you care about as voters. And the first place, and this isn't rocket science, but the first place that I would recommend that you go to is the individual websites of each of the presidential candidates. If you do that, and I did that this morning, and you find Hillary Clinton for America, there will be an icon on her website, issues, and then you can go and you can look where she has very specific public policy proposals related to different issues. Same with Bernie Sanders. And what's interesting, and why I think this is a really worthwhile exercise to do, is because the issues they choose and how they emphasize those issues says a lot about what they're most passionate about as a presidential candidate. And you can do the same thing with the Republican candidates, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and John Kasich. And again, you can find where their focus is, what are their public policy issues that they really care about, and you can look to see how much substance and how much specificity they have to the proposals that they're putting forth. Now, there's also some other really great websites that you can go to do a comparison of where the candidates stand on different issues. One of them that I think is very in-depth is called On the Issues. And this is a website that not only covers the presidential candidates, but the U.S. Senate candidates, the House candidates, the state legislative districts. Vote Smart is another good website to do checking on candidates' positions. And then Ballotpedia, that's ballot and then P-E-D-I-A, is another great website to go to.
Brad, you hit on an interesting point too, and it's important that people recognize they shouldn't believe everything that they read. Most of what you're going to see on these presidential races are advertisements, mailings that are supported by super PACs or candidate committees directly. And so when you see those things and you hear these terrible, terrible things about the candidate that you like or dislike, it's important to look for sourcing and citation for that. Television ads and mail pieces are supposed to be providing these where they're citing something specific, be it a specific vote or a specific quotation. And that gives you the opportunity to then check that out and make sure what they're telling you is accurate. You shouldn't assume that everything you hear is accurate, even if it's coming from the candidate you like. 9 times out of 10, it's their spin on an issue. And so it's really important to do your own independent research too, and not just believe what you see on the television, but actually go back and research that and make sure it's accurate. And those sites really aid in that.
And one site I know that both of you share my high opinion of realclearpolitics.com.
Yeah.
And one of the nice features of it, it samples editorial opinion across the country. So if you want to evaluate your thinking, if you want to compare your interpretation of an issue or a candidate's stand, reading a variety of editorial analyses, I think is a very good and quick way, relatively painless. They're pretty well written most of the time. realclearpolitics.com.
Well, and the other great thing about realclearpolitics.com that Frank just mentioned is, and we're admittedly 3 political junkies here, okay? But, there's a lot of confusion around polling when it comes to elections. And what's great about Real Clear Politics is they take all of the recent polls. So, for example, a Fox poll, it's going to have a little bit of a conservative slant to it. A MSNBC poll might have a little bit of a liberal slant to it. Well, what Real Clear Politics does is it takes the average of all of these polls and comes up with the median. So you can really, I think it's a truer picture of where the candidates stand in the national polling, in the state-by-state polling. And I also know, Dan, before we were going online here today, that as far as the Illinois viewers that are participating in the webinar, that you thought there was another good information site that they could point to with the U.S. Senate race and other races going on.
Yeah, there's a wonderful one in Illinois called capitalfacts.com. That's C-A-P-I-T-O-L facts.com. It's a great source for statewide news in Illinois. I would also echo that when it comes to aggregation of data, another great one on the national level is 538 by Nate Silver. Nate does an excellent job of aggregating polling data and not just giving you a median of it, but also giving you thoughtful analysis of each one and analyzing the factors. He doesn't always get it right, but he certainly does at a much higher rate than other pollsters nationwide. And he's a big numbers guy like most of us are, so he does an excellent job with that.
You know, one other thing that's getting a lot of hype right now, Frank, in the media is the tone to this presidential election and the violence that you see at some of the rallies. Can you give us a little bit of a historical perspective on this? Is this really a new phenomenon, or has this happened in our past?
I don't know whether it's an encouraging sign to say this is not really all that new or a discouraging sign. I mean, you can go back to the early 19th centuries and the battles between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams and just personal, vengeful attacks, not just on the candidates, but on Andrew Jackson's wife, for example. So this is a recurring theme. I think what makes it different today from earlier, people smarter than I have other factors, but I'd say it's the advent of what is called outrage talk, and how there is a multiplier for outrage talk. And let me suggest what I mean by that. There was a recent study of outrage talk, which is defined as talk that is mocking, demeaning. You know from the campaign what outrage talk is. There are 4,000 talk radio programs in the United States. 100% of them engage in outrage talks, outrage talk. Then these researchers looked at Fox News and MSNBC, and they said if you put them together, they engage in outrage talk every other minute. So there is an episode of outrage talk every other minute. And I believe that has led to coarseness in our political discourse, a decline in civility, and it's depressing to me. And I'm just going to stop there.
Well, and those of you, again, that are from Illinois, but even if you're not, I would highly recommend you go to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, Illinois, and they have a wonderful exhibit down there where you're walking through, and there are all these voices coming at you about horribly negative things that were said about President or candidate Lincoln, and then President Lincoln, who obviously turned out to be one of our greatest presidents. So, you know, I would say that politics is not for the faint of heart, and that we've always had hotly contested elections in America. But I would agree with Frank that the advent of social media and also talk radio and cable TV, I think it multiplies the effect maybe than what we've seen in the past.
This is not an original insight, but I think at some point, I don't know when it was, that news became entertainment. And as a result, we lost a certain degree of objectivity. Now we have the ability to only listen in an echo chamber. We can go someplace and get news we know we're going to agree with, which means our views are never challenged. We don't know whether we're right or wrong because we're just listening to ourselves talk. And that has to do with the balkanization of media. Whole nother topic.
Well, and Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, touched on it this morning in a speech, talking about the echo chamber that exists in Washington and how, you know, so much of it, and you see it with the super PACs too, when you have consultants running more and more of what you're seeing and hearing on this, it absolutely is an echo chamber because they're not accountable for what they're saying. No one is out there electing a consultant. No one is out there saying this person should be on the ballot and you should be giving your money to them. It's completely backwards compared to how it used to be. It used to be the candidates that had to say these things, and they're accountable to the voters. And so you do see that, and I thought that Speaker Ryan's comments were pretty spot on calling that out and saying, look, we can stop this. It just requires everyone agreeing to do it. You shouldn't put up with it. I mean, the fights that you see occur in families now, even when you bring up politics and people don't talk to each other for 10 years. I mean, It doesn't have to be that way.
Was it Bob Dole who said, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog?
Yeah. Yeah. My dog, though, I mean, he got mad at me the other day over a button I was wearing, so who knows? I don't know.
Well, I know we've spent a lot of time on looking at the presidential race, but obviously there's more at stake in the November 8th, 2016 election. And so when we look at the U.S. Senate, Dan, what's at stake as far as control of the U.S. Senate?
Sure, absolutely. There's a lot at stake. The current makeup of the Senate is 54 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 1 independent. There's 34 seats up in November. Currently, 24 of those are held by Republicans. So 24 of the 34 seats up for election are held by Republicans. The Democrats need to pick up 5 seats to regain the majority, or if they win the White House, only 4 seats, because of course the vice president serves as a tiebreaker. 7 of those seats that are held by Republicans are in states that voted for President Obama twice. So it's pretty obvious to see why there's so much contested there. What's at stake in the Senate race? Certainly many things long-term are at stake. National security, gun rights, the cabinet appointments for the next president are certainly a few examples. Short-term, you'd be remiss if you didn't say it's the Supreme Court. With the death of Justice Scalia, obviously the direction of the court is really up for grabs with the Senate race as well. 2016's docket, even before we get into the next year, holds major cases affecting immigration reform, mandated union dues, abortion rights and safety, and once again, healthcare reform, this time as it relates to mandated coverage of birth control drugs. For those of you that are still Illinois residents, one of the most hotly contested seats is going to be right here in Illinois between Senator Mark Kirk and Congresswoman Tammy Duckworth. We'll likely also see hotly contested races with former presidential candidate John McCain, where, of course, Supreme Court politics is going to come into play in a huge way in that race. And also competitive races in Missouri, Colorado, Ohio, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Florida, and Wisconsin. Without making any predictions, it's safe to say that all of these races are going to be swayed in a huge way by who's at the top of the ticket on both sides, and whether they have coattails or perhaps, as we'd call them, reverse coattails in these races.
So has it ever happened where, when it's all said and done, it ends up 50-50 in the U.S. Senate, and then what happens if that's the outcome?
It has happened. What happens if that's the outcome? To be determined. I mean, obviously with the Supreme Court, it would obviously force more compromise on that issue, but it largely depends on the tone of the electorate then as well. I mean, we certainly haven't seen a moderation of tone in recent times. So does that mean everyone digs their heels in and fights harder, or does it mean that they come to the table and compromise? We'll see.
Well, and if it does end up being 50-50, that even further heightens the presidential race, because whoever is president, their vice president is the tie-breaking vote in the U.S. Senate, and so they get to take the majority positions. And I think that happened in 2001.
Jeffords switched parties, and we had that effect. Jim Jeffords from Vermont. I would make the argument, I could lose, but I would make the argument that 60 is the key number in the Senate, not 50. because of the filibuster rule. And so a political party needs 60 votes, whether they're all from their own political party or they get some crossovers. To get anything substantial done in the Senate, you need 61 votes.
Certainly in the current climate, we've seen the filibuster used pretty readily, so I think you're right about that.
And looking at the House of Representatives on the House side, right now the Republicans have a very significant majority. There are 246 Republicans on the House side and only 188 Democratic seats. So it's not very likely that you're going to end up seeing a switch as far as the majority party in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Democrats would basically have to take 30 seats, and right now the political analysts say that there are really only 18 competitive toss-up races as far as congressional races across America. So it's likely that the House of Representatives will stay in Republican control, but I think that the U.S. Senate is very much up for grabs in this particular election. And I agree with you, Dan, who is the nominee for president on both sides will have an impact. A lot of the toss-up states in the U.S. Senate are in what are referred to as purple states, which are not strongly aligned with either political party. And so the popularity of who is at the top of the ticket in those particular races could have a dramatic impact.
The wild card factor is huge there too. I mean, in states like Florida, Wisconsin, Illinois, it's going to be a whole different race 3 months from now than it is today. And so I think that there's a lot more likelihood of seeing some back and forth in that regard in those states. I think Nevada is going to stay how it is with Harry Reid's old seat, but I think there's certainly some that are going to be far more hotly contested than others.
And I'm looking forward to seeing who the vice presidential candidates are and what impact that has on the electoral map.
Absolutely.
One of the other things that I would like to encourage our webinar participants on is, even though we're talking about the top races on the ballot, the presidential race and the U.S. Senate and the House races, it's also really, really important that you become informed and knowledgeable on your state candidates and on your local candidates. And an issue that we're working on diligently in Illinois, hopefully that will be on the ballot, is a constitutional amendment with regard to redistricting. And so if that gets on the November ballot, it will be the last thing on the November ballot, but it could also, in my view, be the most important thing for Illinois voters to weigh in on. So just make sure and try to get informed up and down the ballot. Dan, you've got a lot of experience in the area of campaign commercials and messaging and marketing and campaign commercials and mailers. What are some of the things that our online participants should look for, as they get overwhelmed with all of these election year materials?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, sourcing and citations are huge on that. That gives you the ability to go back and look at what they're telling you. Their goal is not to honestly communicate on these issues. It's very important to recognize that. When you get a mailer, when you see a commercial, it is 100% spin. There may be some truth to it, especially if they're sourcing and citations and you go back and research those, but they're selling you a message, just like companies that are running television ads are selling you a message. You know, Coca-Cola really doesn't want to make the world a better place as much as they want to sell Coca-Cola, but the commercials you see are completely about making the world a better place. So it's a product that's being sold, and you have to recognize that. You have to recognize that you're being sold a product, and you have to be an informed consumer by then going back and researching that messaging you're getting. You know, we see the amount of spending on campaign commercials and mailers goes up every year. We know as well as anyone that postcard that you get in the mail, you're not going to sit and read it. We have 7 seconds, 7 seconds before that hits your wastebasket. And so we're going to make sure that we try to get across the best message we can in that 7 seconds. So when you get ready to vote, I would not necessarily go to your file of all the campaign mailers you've gotten and research it that way. I would certainly, you know, go back and check their sourcing and citations and then research those. That's the key to being an informed voter on those issues.
You know, as I was preparing for today's webinar, Tori sent me the list of some of the participants, and I noticed that there was a Green Party candidate, I think a Bradley alum from Hawaii. I'd like to welcome you if you're still online now. But I do commend you for throwing yourself into the political arena. And if I had a wish list for democracy in our country, I wish it was a lot easier for third-party candidates, independent candidates, to be able to actively participate in our political process and not be put on the sidelines. And I don't know if you guys have any comments or reflections related to that, but you know, if you look at the polling data, there are many more Americans that consider themselves more independent than strongly tied to either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Yet it's really, really hard for independent candidates or for third-party candidates to get on the ballot and participate, and even harder for them to be included in debates and other things that are part of our democracy.
I mean, I would just have 2 quick observations. First of all, there are drawbacks to multi-party democracies, and look to Europe and draw your lessons from multi-party democracies outside the United States. Having said that, there's this interesting thread going through Republican circles when they're trying to figure out whether or not they can mount a third party, and it gets to the ballot restrictions and the deadlines by which you have to submit your petitions and signatures to get on a ballot. And on a state-by-state basis, court challenges have rendered those arbitrary and early deadlines illegal, unlawful. And so on a state-by-state basis, the judicial system have said, no, you can't set a deadline 4 months before the election saying that you have to be on the ballot by then. So I think Texas is the next very early, and maybe it's April 7th. If you're a third party or want to get on the ballot, you have until April 7th. How many months away from the election is that? I can't do the math, so I'll leave that to someone else on the panel.
Well, and I would also say whether you're a third-party candidate or a major party candidate, or just an informed voter, I think it's important to get involved in that aspect. I think everyone at some point in their life, whether it be in college or later in their life, should volunteer for a political campaign they believe in. They should take the time and do that. It's kind of like working in customer service. It's important to do that at one point in your life, and I feel it's important to do that for political campaigns as well. You're going to be all the better and all the more informed voter by doing that, and you're going to see the hard work that goes on behind the scenes. And perhaps after doing that, you'll find that you want to get more involved and you don't like the process. I've certainly heard about that on both sides of the aisle, especially when it comes to superdelegates. People say, how undemocratic is that? But the way to fix that is to get involved. I mean, that's the party structure that sets that, and that's the supporters and the volunteers and the voters. So,
Well, and I get asked often by the media as to, what's the biggest issue, facing our country, our state. And my honest response to that is apathy. If you look at the percentage of voters that we have that are actually participating in our primaries and even in our presidential elections, we fall way behind the voter turnouts of other democracies in the world. And the only way that we, in my view, can turn things back in a better direction is by having more people participate. And so I commend those that are participating in the webinar today to maybe learn a little bit more. And I do think do we have a few questions that?
They're up on the screen.
Okay, so I can't see it because it's not facing towards me, Alyssa, there. How can, so this is a question I will pose to our panelists. How can voters make an informed choice when only the two major parties are ever covered? And I would think that they mean by the media.
I'm going to leave aside the question that if you're intending to vote for someone outside the major two parties, I mean, frankly, it's a vote lost. So to me, then, if you want to make an informed choice within the realistic options for having an impact, the two major parties, as much as I think social media has harmed politics, I'm going to give a shout out to Google and say, if you want to make an informed choice, spend some time sourcing, validating the information, but you have access to information that for my parents, it's unheard of. So informed choice, you have more options to be informed than anyone in history.
and media largely has been, throughout our history, a choke point for information, frankly. I mean, it goes back to the network setup that used to exist where you only got your nightly news from one of four sources. And now it makes it very challenging for consultants because you try to say, where can I place ads that people will see them? Half the country doesn't have cable. Half the country is streaming the shows they're watching. Many, may not even have an internet connection at their house. They may be completely Wi-Fi. The diversity of how people are consuming their information these days is wider and wider. And if that doesn't present the biggest opportunity for third parties or alternate parties to make an impact in those forums, now that they have more opportunity to do it and the people are spread out on those forums, it's never been a better opportunity, frankly.
I totally agree with Dan's statement as far as the opportunities to find out, do your research and find out information on all of the candidates, including third-party candidates. Realistically, though, the major media is only going to cover the top candidates. It's a popularity contest. It's a ratings contest. And so they're only going to cover the ones that are really in the news. And there's really not, in my view, a whole lot that can change that dynamic.
The best way to inform yourself is turn off cable news.
I think there are a few more questions to come in, and as they're getting typed onto the screen, I know someone asked about the websites that were discussed during the webinar today, and we will be getting those out to you in the follow-up email that goes out with the link to the video of this presentation along with the survey. So I think, Brad, there's a question at the top of the screen if you want to.
Okay, so this is another question from one of our participants. Is it possible, that's to get the...
No, is it possible to get the public support to have a particular candidate taken out of the race?
So, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
We'll both point to Dan for that one.
I get where the question is derived from and sympathize. But I think our democracy benefits when we have a large diversity of opinions in the race. If you're really fired up against a candidate, you shouldn't be working to get them out. You should be finding a better alternative and working to get them in. I think that's the best way to go. I will also say, when it comes to how you do that, one of my personal pet peeves is right behind apathy is what I would call slacktivism. Not activism, but slacktivism. And that's where we all have a friend that's like this. They're on social media. They are the most political person you've ever met, and they've never done anything on a political campaign except share memes that are highly inaccurate. That is a real problem in our democracy, and I think that people, if you have a strong opinion and want to get involved, the best way to do that is reach out to a candidate you support, reach out to their campaign, and do something substantive. Walk door to door for them, make phone calls for them. You're going to gain so much more about the political process by doing that than simply sharing memes online and the more slacktivist activities that we see. But going back to the question, I think it's better for our democracy when the process plays out on its own and we focus on supporting candidates that we want in, as opposed to trying to get controversial ones that we don't like out of the race. You may find that actually it's far more successful to leave them in the race and give people a more stark choice. So just keep that in mind.
So Frank, we're not going to let you off the hook. One of our online participants, the next question is, who is likely to win the presidential election based on the matrix Frank shared? So there you go, Frank.
The 6 sets of factors that I talked about at the beginning aren't predictive of who will win an election. So I suspect the person who posed the question is familiar with another talk I give, which identifies 13 keys that have predicted the outcome of every presidential election since 1860 on popular vote. So for example, in 2000, it predicted Al Gore would win. He did win the popular vote, but not the Electoral College vote. So there are these 13 keys, not original to me. I'll just bottom line it. Most of the keys are already established or known. They have to do with economic performance and some other things. It's a cliffhanger right now. So it wouldn't be very reliable for predicting. And let me give you one example. There are, among the 13 keys, 2 charisma keys. So if the Democratic candidate, eventual candidate, is charismatic, that's a strength to the Democratic Party. So you have to decide, is Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders charismatic? On the Republican side, there's a second charisma key. And I would have to say that Donald Trump would win the charisma key for the Republicans based on the definition of charisma in this model. If the Democratic candidate is not charismatic and the Republican candidate is, the keys right now say the Republican wins.
And it's important, I think you would concede, what we all view as what we find personally charismatic is not necessarily what you're factoring into that. It's far more averaged across the populace. So while we may find someone personally appalling or personally charismatic, we have this way of thinking where we think that the way that we think is how everyone thinks. No, and that's simply not the case.
And the only thing I would say before I turn it over to Tori is there hasn't been much about this particular presidential race that's been conventional.
No.
It's been highly unconventional. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in November. So I'll turn it over to you, Tori.
Thank you, Frank, Dan, and Brad, for joining us today to discuss the many ways we can be informed for the 2016 elections. All of you that are joining us today, we ask you to please complete the post-webinar survey, or if you have questions or comments about any other alumni programming, please don't hesitate to call or email our office. Thanks again for joining us today. We hope you have a fantastic afternoon.
Remember to take your phones off airplane mode.
Perhaps a more peaceful day would be to not take them.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks for the
As always,
invitation.
it's a pleasure being with you.
I realized
small
afterwards
gifts
I
for
accidentally unnecessarily took
She
a
comes
shot.
bearing gifts. She comes bearing gifts.
Oh, my.
Gifts.
Oh, thank you.
Your time today.
Oh,
We
wonderful.
appreciate the time.
Yeah.
I will keep you posted. You still have a question about the webinar,
Yeah.
about the websites. So if you'll both maybe email Brad, he may know the ones you guys mentioned.
Maybe send me an email on the ones that you mentioned.
And I mentioned a couple articles too. Do you want me to send links?
Send
to
what-
those?
So if you want to send links
Yeah,
to
anything you
those.
guys want to send me. I mean,
Okay.
I've got the ones that I have, but if there's some, like,
You had real clear politics already.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I have the ones that look smarter on the issues and, but if you, and it, maybe like, if you have any articles or anything related to the characteristics and the,
And the